So our distinguished speaker today is Professor Sophal, who is Associate Dean of Student Success and a professor at the Thunderbird School of Management here at ASU, where he lectures on global political economy, international organizations, and regional management in Asia. He's a graduate of Princeton and UC Berkeley, where he earned a number of MAs and a doctorate in political science. He also moved from Cambodia to France at the age of 10 and eventually came to the US. His public works and honors include a long list. And so I only want to say a few and mention in particular the TED Fellowship and the Fulbright Fellowship, and also your role on the Southeast Asia Development Program and for your role on the board of the Center for Khmer Studies. Professor has narrated an award-winning documentary, The End, Beginning Cambodia, and he is author of 3 major books, one of which is The Aid Dependence in Cambodia, How Foreign Assistance Undermines Democracy. And he is co-author of The Hungry Dragon, How China's Resources Quest Has Reshaped the World. His talk today is entitled The Political Economy of Diseases in Southeast Asia, and it's based on his 3rd book, Viral Sovereignty and Political Economy of Pandemics, published by Routledge in 2002. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Julia, and I really appreciate this opportunity, and thank you for joining today. I know that it's time away from your work and other responsibilities to be here. I'm just glad that I've finally been able to make this happen, because I've had some cancellations, movements of dates and so on, but to present to you some of the ideas from my latest book, Viral Sovereignty and the Political Economy of Pandemics, What Explains How Countries Deal with Outbreaks, is the idea of today's talk, book talk. The focus, obviously, the chapters deal with Southeast Asia, some of them, and others don't. So in this presentation, I'll talk about Southeast Asia first in terms of countries in the region that are of relevance to the center here. But I'll also talk about Mexico, and I'll also talk about countries in Africa as well, and their experiences in sort of shaping the narrative of this book. All right, so just as Julianne mentioned, I have my trajectory in terms of Asian emphasis started long ago. My first book on Aid Dependence in Cambodia was a study of how foreign aid disrupts democracy by making countries, governments take foreign aid and not tax their people as much, at least officially not as much, because they would rather take unofficial taxes, bribes, in other words. It's a nice way of saying corruption. Instead, so that they can do other things, private things with that money for themselves, enrich themselves. But the official sort of tax levels are too low, relatively speaking. And then The Hungry Dragon was a book examining China's involvement in Angola, Brazil, and Cambodia, and how that impacts the foreign policies of these countries, their support for Chinese policies, whether it's sending Uyghurs back to China when they've landed in Cambodia, for example, or doing things that are clearly pleasing to China when it comes to voting on Xinjiang or on Hong Kong, or saying something that China would like. First, a few words of appreciation. Obviously, Professor Julianne Schober, thank you. As director, you've been so supportive since I've arrived here, since we connected, and I really appreciate your help. Chan, for countless emails back and forth about things related to this appearance of mine. Thank you for that. The center for supporting this talk today, and of course everyone here, whether on Zoom or in the room. I really appreciate your being here. So let me just launch into the main sort of ideas here and start off with a picture from a certain period. I remember when I would give this talk, and it was like maybe before the pandemic, of early versions before the book came out, and I'd say, okay, what is this picture about? And then folks wouldn't have any idea. But nowadays, the folks have much better idea what this picture is about. But let me just pose the question of what is this? What are we looking at here? Would somebody like to venture a guess?
Spanish flu.
Spanish flu, right? Absolutely. And what year was that?
1919.
1918. Yes, Spanish flu. And why was it called Spanish flu?
Not sure. No good reason, right?
Yeah, no. I mean, it's like very curious. Yes.
It was during World War I, so there was a lot of control of the news.
Absolutely. You're the first person to ever have the answer.
And
Yeah.
the first notable death was the King of Spain, I think. So that's why they called it the Spanish flu.
Absolutely. Okay, you basically gave the spoiler to my whole query, which is fantastic because I'm glad. Do you study this area or?
I'm a historian.
Okay, there you go. There you go. Absolutely. And it's really because there were powers that were fighting each other, and Spain was neutral, and therefore the news censors would block reporting about the countries that were at war, and then they would say, oh, Spain has this horrible outbreak of this disease, and it became Spain gets to name the disease Spanish influenza, a new name for an old familiar disease. And in fact, Spanish flu, here, it's exactly what you said. To maintain morale, wartime censors minimized early newspaper reports of illness and mortality in Germany, Britain, France, and the United States, but papers were free to report the epidemic's effects in neutral Spain, such as the grave illness of King Alfonso XIII, creating a false impression of Spain as especially hard hit, thus the pandemic's nickname, Spanish flu. And we've seen this with other situations like swine flu. Okay, so suddenly in Egypt, they decide that they've got to go after all the pigs and so on, and just because that's the name of it. And so they go on a campaign of terror against people who aren't observant, I guess, in terms of pork. But yeah, so epidemic influenza, and then even here at the Navy Yard, I believe this is probably the Navy Yard of Washington, D.C., because that's the only one I know, but there could be many Navy Yards. But Spanish influenza has endangered the prosecution of the war in Europe. There are 1,500 cases in the Navy Yard. 30 deaths have already resulted. Spitting spreads Spanish influenza, don't spit. But the effects of Spanish flu were incredibly severe. I mean, as a disease, it caused 50 to 100 million deaths worldwide, described as the greatest medical holocaust in history, and may have killed more people than the Black Death. Said that the flu killed more people in 24 weeks than AIDS has in 24 years, more in a year than the Black Death killed in a century. And the toll of COVID-19 globally so far is 6.83 million, on a planet with 4 times the population of 1918. And it's really thanks to the advances in public health, the wearing of masks, social distancing, and a series of vaccines with incredible technologies allowing these vaccines to be created so quickly that enabled so many to avoid death in this case. But the question has got to be, what are the business implications? What are the policy implications when countries do not handle outbreaks of novel diseases effectively? What does it mean when a country, as happened in Indonesia during H5N1, decide to declare viral sovereignty and refuses to hand over samples of a virus? This is the idea that, and I'll talk about it some more later, but the idea that a virus is like the intellectual property of a country, like a flower or some sort of creation per intellectual property rights. And why would a country do this? So the whole topic of the book is this notion of, why would a country behave like Indonesia? And is that an abhorrent sort of situation that we should fight against, or is it because they have real reason to do that? And we kind of saw that with H5, with the COVID, when the rubber meets the road. There were, I think, American buyers on tarmacs trying to grab whatever they could from airplanes, PPE, personal protective equipment, gloves, masks, whatever there was. So it's basically whoever has the money can purchase what they need. And there are serious and wide-ranging implications. For example, Yelp showed that 60% of businesses closed due to the coronavirus. 60% of the business closures are now permanent, exceeding 100,000 in the US alone. Globally, the World Bank found that the following sectors with the most business closures: travel, tourism, tourist agencies, 54% closed; hospitality and event services, 47%; education and childcare, 45%; performing arts, entertainment, 36%; cafes, restaurants, 32%. And it brings into focus the vaccine diplomacy, vaccine nationalism with, Sputnik in Russia, the Sinopharm and other Chinese versions of the vaccine, and then in the US with the Operation Warp Speed that resulted in the Moderna vaccine and Pfizer vaccines to come out, and BioNTech, Pfizer-BioNTech. And of course, politically, I'm sure you're familiar with this image here, or maybe it's a faint memory now that he's left the White House. But, telephoto lenses can do miracles in capturing exactly what's written, what has been crossed out and replaced with Chinese instead of Corona, in order to stoke racial animus, nationalism, and so on. So, that is what some politicians choose to do, as opposed to rise above the moment. And as well, what policies we choose matters. The average life expectancy doubled in the last century, from 1918-ish period, 1920, to the present, to 2020, right? The average global life expectancy was 35 years in 1920. I know it sounds ridiculously low, like, really? That sounds like Middle Ages type of life expectancy, but actually that was probably, I don't know, in your 20s it'd be gone, but it's a 70 years. So you've essentially created another life as a result of public health measures, just technology and other things. Humanity gave itself an extra life. So this is what my third book is really trying to get at, this idea about global lessons of the past, whether it's from Indonesia, Cambodia, Mexico, and beyond, as we enter what the Thunderbird School calls the fourth industrial revolution, or really the World Economic Forum in Switzerland likes to promote us this idea, like we've entered these phases and now we're in the fourth IR. And it's the work behind this book really started a decade ago. I have to say it took a long gestational route. I was, doing my dissertation when I first started writing about a highly pathogenic avian influenza, and so the response to Cambodia's reaction by doing papers for the STEP Center, which is part of the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, as well as book chapters on Cambodia's Patient Zero, global and national responses to highly pathogenic avian influenza, and then moving on to actually going to live markets. Live markets, by the way, are the markets where there are live birds, poultry sold, because There, in certain cultures, having live poultry cooked fresh is more desirable than some sort of cold chain, frozen or refrigerated version that's been already cleaned up, and you don't have to see any feathers or any of that horrible stuff that goes in the process of actually turning what was a live animal into meat for you. But the killing, the abattoir type activity would happen inside the markets, and so you'd have all this sort of like, why are we talking about, for example, the Wuhan seafood market? It's because there's live animals sold there, and the belief is that perhaps something jumped from an animal to a human in that live market. As well as inside that first book of mine, I had a chapter on an international problem and sort of Cambodia's handling of that. So this led to some work with the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which was interested in figuring out, well, primarily how to prevent what's known as zoonosis, the jumping of a disease from an animal to a human, and using military labs that are across the world in different continents, US military labs, to kind of study what goes on in those countries. Now, was it the intention of those labs to do that, or was it in fact to do military readiness? The argument has always got to be that the US military needs to be ready to engage in another country, and the best way to do that is to at least have some presence there to kind of know what the situation is. Nowadays, it's being used as a kind of argument about Ukraine, something about gain of function research in labs that were actually all intended and were really, in fact, for helping the Ukrainians get better at their public health, right? But you can do disinformation campaigns and twist that into something else. In the following slides, I use a comparative case study approach. This is sort of the methodological explanation: elite surveys, semi-structured interviews, content analysis of interviews and transcripts. Actually, let me ask, Chen, should we remove some of the pictures if you can? That way you can see more of the slide. Yeah, there you go. Great. And so I started publishing from that research in journals, for example, Asian Security, Emerging Infectious Disease Surveillance in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Indonesia, and the US Naval Medical Research Unit 2. And I don't know, how many of you have ever heard of NAMRU by chance? NAMRU, I mean, you did, Jim, you're an Indonesian historian, but NAMRU was like for decades in Indonesia, and this is US Navy lab, and they were supposed to help, the Indonesians be more, ready for outbreaks and so on, as well as prepare our own soldiers for situations where they'd have to go to Indonesia or to the region. But there was a whole controversy, and I'll talk a lot more about that in the next few slides. But, and as well at the same time during this whole episode, swine flu came about. Swine flu in 2009 was, the first pandemic of the new century, really, and you expect about 2 to 3 pandemics per century. This is already, we're on to our site. We've already done our second one with COVID. So I guess we've got another one coming up in the next 80 years. But so in presenting sort of what the flow of the next set of slides is going to be about, I want to talk about the problems, Indonesia case study, Cambodia case study, go into Mexico, and actually deviate over to Africa. It's not mentioned here, and then conclude with a few thoughts. But the problems that we observe in disease surveillance and prevention in terms of how to catch a disease before it becomes a problem for humans is that we're dealing with resource poor environments, right? Developing countries that don't have a lot of financial resources. So they have poor to non-existent surveillance of diseases. They have poor diagnostic lab capacity. There's a disincentive to report. Reason being, if you say you've got a problem, the authorities come to you and make your problem even worse because you have now told them to come and destroy all your poultry. And that's really bad. But, these are the kinds of considerations one does not necessarily think about when it's like, okay, well, this is good for public health, but it's actually really bad if you think about incentives. Viral sovereignty, and I mentioned that. Now, viral sovereignty, Indonesia in 2006 claimed viral sovereignty over samples of H5N1 collected within its borders and announced that it would not share them until the World Health Organization and developed countries established an equitable means of sharing the benefits, e.g. vaccines. So they're saying, I'm not going to give you the sample that you need to create the vaccine unless a priori you agree to give me the vaccine, right? So like, help me out here. I'll help you, but you can't just say, I took the sample from your country and now here's for $200 million a vaccine if you'd like to purchase it from me. It's a little bit like a hostage situation, but I would say there are reasons for why countries who don't have the means to, don't have the technology, don't have the resources would say, no, you've got to help us out here. And of course, what it's done is, if you want to think about it in terms of international relations and security studies, it has securitized health. What used to be something that was considered global health, public health interests, where it makes sense to share what you have in terms of what put up the DNA of this and that, has become securitized. And securitized, I don't mean by mortgage-backed securities. I mean become a security consideration, and why countries will not cooperate anymore with one another as a result. It's a bargaining chip. The state of global health has not been good in the poorest countries. You're seeing here GAO, Government Accountability Report Office report from a few years back, but the situation hasn't changed. So even 20 years ago, it was 3% of expenditure in high income countries. That's the amount that the poorest countries spend. And then the staff in over 90% are not familiar with quality assurance principles. These are the things that tell you, is this really what you say it is, as opposed to, oh, it got all mixed up and it's, who knows, there was a problem in contamination. More than 60% of lab equipment is outdated or not functioning. And then by 2010, and still I would argue in the 2020s, the situation hasn't changed. The experts who know to whom I've spoken have said that. Now, as I mentioned, 2 to 3 pandemics per century. In the in the last century, you had Spanish influenza. Then you had a bunch of other outbreaks, but not full-on pandemics. It's just that the Hong Kong flu, for example, and then the HPAI, highly pathogenic avian influenza, shows up. These could be epidemics, but we're when we map out sort of the trajectory of this, it's clear that these happen when you have more and more globalization taking place. Because, for example, with SARS, this was a great example. SARS saw the biggest country, the country that was most affected was Hong Kong, and it started in Hong Kong. It's China, and it started in Hong Kong. And then the second most affected country is, if you look at the map, Canada. Right. So, Shan, why do you think it was Canada?
Because they have a lot of people going in and out of China.
Yeah, right. I mean, look, after 1997, Hong Kongers who wanted to have permanent residency in Canada could go to Vancouver, right, or Toronto, and so it became kind of like these direct flights that would take people to their second homes, or basically where they park their money or whatever. So this is the reason why Canada became the second most affected of the countries with severe acute respiratory syndrome. And then from a emerging diseases and re-emerging diseases perspective, you've got West Nile. We hear about it here in Arizona. You've got Nipah and Hendra virus, also bad connected diseases. You have Ebola. You have SARS. Of course, SARS the better version of SARS became COVID, and bird flu. So, and then swine flu, of course, out of Mexico. That's that. Now that's not even the whole landscape. And in terms of quality of healthcare in 2002, it was unsuitable in most of Africa, for example. It remains a huge challenge. Parts of Asia, really problematic. So it, you know, when I'll talk about the Cambodia case, for example, the first person to have had it was discovered in Vietnam. She got sick, went to Vietnam for healthcare. And so it was a Vietnamese hospital that then determined that she has bird flu, and then informed the Cambodian authorities that we have a Cambodian citizen with bird flu. And then her brother actually died before her, but was cremated. So we don't even know, maybe he was the first person. It's like, okay, they go where they can get healthcare. And then, you know, by 2015, it's still pretty much the same. So the situation in Cambodia is going to be very interesting when we get to it. But let me talk about the Indonesia case study. So this lab, NAMRU 2, was operating in Indonesia, had operated for nearly 4 decades, and was suddenly kicked out of Indonesia. And it was interesting to the Defense Threat Reduction Agency as to why would a lab that had been welcomed for nearly 4 decades be suddenly kicked out. And the narrative was very much that the Minister of Health of Indonesia at the time, Siti Fardila Supari, was adamant that this lab basically was doing some kind of bioweapon research. And so this narrative is maybe this disinformation campaign began. So when talking to people in Indonesia about the situation, who were experts, who were elites in that realm, it was like poor host donor relationship, different host donor priorities. So, you know, NAMRU 2 versus the Indonesian government having different priorities, low staff compensation in the Ministry of Health, decline in the Ministry of Health quality of staff, you know, these kinds of considerations. I'm not going to read all of them, but needless to say, clearly there was a disconnect between what Indonesians in the higher levels of government thought NAMRU 2 was doing and what NAMRU 2 was in fact saying it was doing. It didn't help, by the way, that the minister would say, I think there are CIA agents working in NAMRU 2, and then it turned out that there was a CIA agent working in NAMRU 2. So it's just really stupid when you like the fantasy becomes reality because, you know, actually, you know, somebody got the brilliant idea of planting someone there. But why would the lack of, one of the reasons that I didn't mention in the survey was, you know, why would the lack of compensation be a problem? Well, the lack of compensation, of course, is you don't give people money when you go and cull their poultry, they won't report because you've just destroyed their livelihoods. One of the interesting aspects of all this is that there was also a kind of thrust towards publish or perish, right? Like you've got in NAMRU 2, at least at the beginning of NAMRU 2, you had these senior scientists go there and they were established already. They didn't need to publish anything more. They had already done all the publishing they needed, the equivalent of tenured full professors. Well, the new NAMRU 2 scientists coming from the United States were younger and they needed to publish. So they pushed for these studies. And some of these studies would do like things like, hey, Indonesia sample 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it would go into some journal, and then the Minister of Health would read it and say, what the hell is Indonesia 1, 2, 3? Where did you get these samples from? Well, of course, it came from Indonesia. That's why it was called Indonesia. But they didn't get permission to take it out. And then, you know, somehow it got in the hands of Baxter Pharmaceuticals, which then made a vaccine that they then tried to sell to the minister. And that's how she became convinced that you're taking out samples, you're not telling us about it, we didn't give you permission to do it. So this is terrible.
What is the date?
The date of all of this happening?
Yeah, roughly.
So it's about 2010. So in fact, after I'd visited and met some of the NAMRU 2 staff, the I get this random email. It almost feels like the CIA agent is writing to me. But anyhow, Namru 2, Jakarta is shutting down. I've been very sad, not only because I'm losing my job, but more than that, Indonesia will lose an established lab because of political reasons. I mean, that's basically the argument of why, even with the best technology, you can't necessarily assume that your technology is going to trump the politics of the situation. You could still have a president that says bleach is the answer, or sunshine will kill everything. Yeah, that's fine. It's true. UV, but yeah, it's just fascinating in that sense. And then the Cambodia. Let me keep track of time here. Ooh. We're okay. I might have to skip a few countries after this. So Cambodia case study, the 9th victim of bird flu. Here he is, a very lucky guy because he's the only one to have lived up to that point. The previous 8 were found dead, so or alive, but basically died because it was too late for them. This guy walks into a clinic in the countryside, and somehow there's a Namru 2 study happening. So serological study, give us some blood samples. 2 weeks later, they discover that he's got bird flu, H5N1, and they actually locate him. And so he gets the care he needs. I actually think he probably would have survived because he doesn't seem like, maybe he would have been one of the survivors because it was clear that perhaps his blood was a little bit better than the previous 8. But anyways, he gets to live. And then the next one is also found by Namru 2 and lives. And then after that, they die because the folks discovered subsequently died. But the main point of all this is that if you think about a surveillance system for animal outbreaks to human outbreaks, you would try to basically find where the animal outbreaks are, kill off the poultry there of whatever it is that's coming in, whatever animals are possibly the culprit, and then it would, in theory, stop the potential for the disease to jump into humans, right? Well, so that's a map of Cambodia from 2004 to 2008 with animal outbreaks mapped out per year. Then here is the human victims map, 2005 to 2008. And the problem that I see here is generally one where actually what happens is the animal outbreaks are discovered because humans died. So people die, you go to where they died, and then you start killing the animals around that area that you think might be the cause of that. So the canaries in the coal mine aren't the animals, they're the humans. Total reverse of what's supposed to happen, but that is alas what happened. That's when you really don't have great surveillance, I guess. The issues raised in Cambodia were not dissimilar, but this low staff compensation, which we saw in Indonesia, appears here as the #1 reason. Donor dependence, pathologies, poor staff management, human resources, patronage networks, no compensation for calling, differing host and donor priorities, also seen in Indonesia. And so what would be the narrative of this? But that, donors are interested in reducing the potential of these diseases from attacking their own countries, right? So the kind of altruism of like, I'm here to help you to prevent the disease from killing your people is kind of subverted by the idea that I'm actually here to protect myself by making sure that whatever happens in your country stays in your country and doesn't go anywhere else. And that's why it's very self-serving and problematic in that sense. The patronage, this is an older map now, but it's still a goodie. I would say the prime minister is in the center here of Cambodia, and then his in-laws are in yellow and they rule various ministries. So, that's great for like stability purposes, but it's not great for accountability reasons. And in 2000, I want to say 8, there was an election, and for the entire year, there was not a single outbreak reported of bird flu. It's as if, as I like to say, the virus knew to stay out of Cambodian politics. So, there you go. And then subsequently, again, in Cambodia, no compensation for calling. So it caused people to basically not report. They're not going to be incentivized. It's completely contrary to their best interest to report it. In fact, if you think about it, the most rational thing to do from an economic perspective, if you have any problem with your poultry, is to do what? Kill them, put it in a pot, eat it immediately before it's worthless, or sell it so that it goes out. You get some money out of it, and at least you didn't lose everything, right? I mean, it's a real kind of like crazy situation, but that's really the setup. And then tourism is so big in Cambodia, they just don't want bad news about funny little diseases causing deaths in random people, right? The tourists will be scared and won't come. They had these behavior change modification type posters where the messaging is wash your hands, cook your food thoroughly, blow your nose with tissues, don't touch poultry. Clearly, these are messages. And why isn't awareness enough to, you ask people, you should do this. Yeah, they all know it. It's not like they're stupid or anything, but why would they be aware and still not do what the messaging tells them to do? Anybody? Why, something's the right thing to do, but you're not doing it. That's infrastructure, sure. Lack of money, come on. Soap, clean water. This is all very, very expensive stuff that poor people don't necessarily have constant access to, especially the clean water. Or in the case of quarantining poultry. The message from Super Chicken here, Super Muan, is to new poultry, put it in a little cage and wait a certain number of days before the stuff we've been doing with COVID, right? So it's fascinating, but it's just too like that costs money, and people don't want to bother with that. And oh, by the way, all this time there's been this other disease called Newcastle disease that has the same kind of effect on the poultry. It's basically like a flu for your birds, the mass die-offs. There's a vaccine, but they don't have the resources for that, even though it's not expensive. But like, if there's another disease that's very similar to bird flu, but does not have any impact on humans, you're probably, and it's been happening every year, and then mass die-offs of poultry, you're probably just going to go with, in all likelihood, that's what's happening, right? Like, I'm not going to call in the authorities every time my birds my poultry is sick. In fact, with Newcastle disease, farmers who really wanted to save their poultry would actually, this sounds disgusting, I'm sorry to have to say this, but would like suck their beak to like remove the congestion out of their poultry. So the PPE was sent in that period, all this protective equipment, USAID, and so on. And I think because of lack of time, I'm going to skip the case studies of Mexico, which are outside the region, although there's some funny stuff that goes on there. For example, the Minister of Health saying that there were 100 of the 159 deaths, 26 have been proven to have the virus and 7 are confirmed, which seems to be a total contradiction of 26 confirmed, but 7 confirmed, but 26 have been proven. But this is the kind of stuff that happens when you're doing, you're speaking in public, your numbers don't add up, it doesn't make any sense, right? And I'll skip the case study on Ebola. But one has to wonder about what it is that organizations like the WHO are supposed to do. For example, when the World Health Organization's then Director General was asked if she could put together an army of experts and health workers to combat an outbreak overtaking some of the world's poorest countries, she said, "I wish I could do that." By the way, she was in charge of Hong Kong's health system during outbreaks of SARS. And she said it was fantasy, she argued, to think of the WHO as a first responder ready to lead the fight against deadly outbreaks around the world. And that the WHO is in fact a convener of high-level meetings, bringing people together, countries together to talk about, what should be done. And of course, Médecins Sans Frontières said, the head at the time said, we cannot wait for those high-level meetings to convene and discuss over cocktails and petit fours what they're going to do. And I, of course, had to have the petit fours there to get your appetite going. But what lessons can be drawn? Lesson number one, politics matters. Oops, I jumped to lesson 2 too quickly there. Politics, as much as we wish it were technical problems with technical solutions, politicians will say the cure cannot be worse than the disease. We heard it from the previous US president, the cure can't be worse than the disease. It's true though, it is true that the cure can't be worse. I mean, you can't take such draconian action that whatever the potential sort of damage from disease, in the case of bird flu, it wasn't that great. It was a few people who died, would somehow hurt an entire nation. But that is sometimes, you just don't know what the outcome might be. So you don't want to take chances. And then lesson 2 that, and Churchill had said scientists should be on tap, but not on top. But I changed it to technology should be on tap, but not on top. By that, he meant that the real decision makers are the politicians, the elected officials, not the scientists. And that the scientists can advise, but they can't be the ones to basically call, make the decisions for the nation. And that technology also can't be in that position of necessarily being the only thing that determines what happens next. And that, viral sovereignty is about leverage at the global level. Who will have the vaccine? Never mind who owns it. Good leaders want their people to live and succeed. No vaccine is an existential threat. So yeah, so just looping back to the idea of around the turn of the second industrial revolution, 1918, you had 50 to 100 million people die. You have a situation now with COVID where global leaders are making remarkable strides. And that slide from earlier, how humanity gave itself an extra life, is really, the kind of thing that we should rely on. But this is all about, that the public health measures that were undertaken, the science that mattered, and of course, the politics and the activism that led to policies that changed our ability to live that allowed us to live an extra life. And so, we can't have this is straight from Thunderbird's mission here, a world with sustainable and equitable prosperity without investing in basic health infrastructure. So when we think about, okay, we've got we've got some new disease, some novel disease, are we going to simply hand over some kind of testing kit that just gets at the disease, or shouldn't we be helping the country improve its overall basic health care before going into something that is, just for the donor country's benefit, which is the whole dilemma of, donor countries want the disease to not come to them. So then they start investing in things that make sense for them, but not in the recipient country. Anyways, thank you. I think I went only slightly over, 9 minutes over, but I'd love to take your questions, and, we can start with online. How about that? Are there online questions?
Not yet.
Not yet, or hands raised or anything? I want to allow the folks who are technologically or at least not in the room to have a shot first at asking anything or commenting in any way. 12 participants. That's you and me to include, so it's about 10. Yeah.
We should
Oh.
start out.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I was just gonna let him be part of a Zoom session, not the webinar. The webinar is so can't communicate, can't talk to each other.
You can
But okay.
switch back
Yeah.
to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we do encourage you online to submit your questions, and we'll switch back to you when there is one. But for folks in the room, comments, questions?
Sure, this gentleman here.
I guess my question would be, how do you see the current state of things? Do you think things are improving, moving in the right direction, or are we still having the problems?
Well, unfortunately, I think that we are infinitely capable of forgetting lessons as soon as the problem has been resolved, or as soon as we're over the hump. So as much as I'd like to think that okay, now we understand that $16 trillion is not the way. Like if you had just spent a few $1 billion to prevent $16 trillion worth of damage from COVID, it would have been worth it, right? I mean, in retrospect, but too often it's a short-sighted sort of like, well, okay, we're back to like, whatever the next political news cycle is about, and not really investing the resources needed to prevent the next pandemic, which we know will happen, right? I mean, as I said, 2 to 3, possibly more pandemics per century. So we've got another one coming up in the next 80 years. No doubt about it. Will we be ready? I think Bill Gates had an op-ed saying that he's already afraid that we're not ready again, once again. And he had, prior to COVID, pointed out and fought for, pandemic preparedness using his Gates Foundation. So, I don't think we've necessarily prepared ourselves for what's next.
Yeah, so I wanted to pick up on some of the themes that you raised in this, because I didn't hear as much as I would have liked. You sounded very skeptical about the attitude of the Indonesians and the Cambodians and the people behind viral sovereignty.
Oh yeah, no, but I actually
Whereas-
tried to be fair about it. I
whereas
tried to be fair.
I
about
actually
it.
think that they have a very valid point of view.
Yes, yes.
So if we contrast it, so there's 2 questions. One is, if we contrast viral sovereignty with what we might call corporate sovereignty, and I'm thinking particularly of big pharma, which side would you come down on in terms of sorting this out? Wait.
Right.
Related question.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of my former colleague Lyle Fernley's on Lyle was at Singapore University of Technology and Development, works on this stuff. And he's been arguing for some time that we need to get away, because of the circulation maps that you showed us, we need to get away from these origin stories and make it seem as if there are these hotspots around the world. And apparently WHO also is trying to kind of move away from that way of thinking.
Yeah.
Not to say that they don't necessarily have these all come from somewhere in that sense, but the point isn't actually that you can sort it out at the place of origin without thinking about circulation as primary or foundational,
Right.
as this question of origin. So both of them.
Absolutely. Look, on your first question, viral sovereignty versus corporate sovereignty, you're absolutely right that in fact the narrative that I try to present is that there is a very legitimate concern for nations that cannot produce the technology or do not have the technology required to produce the vaccine and the solutions or whatnot, that it's been a very unfair system. And if anything, COVID showed how incredibly unfair it was, because who is still waiting to get vaccinated? They've already gotten the disease by now, so that they've built up some kind of immunity, because it was like, if you're from a rich nation, there will be a stockpile for you of Pfizer BioNTech ready to rescue you. And in fact, it'll be more of a pulling your teeth about, please come and get your vaccine, because we can't seem to, like, you're not coming to get your vaccine while others are like dying to get the vaccine, right? So yes, absolutely. And the new international health regulations were supposed to kind of address Indonesia's concerns, and we just have to see, like, does it make sense for, and in any case, they can't hide it for that long, right? Like the first passenger that leaves that has it will be a carrier, and they can get it from that person. But if you want to really find out where something comes from, which touches on your second question, which is the origin stories and so on, then that gets you to the narrative of like, oh my God, this kind of heart of darkness type of thing of like, and I've actually in the past shown this little docudrama that the BBC did, or one of the BBC shows did in Cambodia, where it's like the entire plot across this like 20-minute little docudrama was an outbreak from bird flu becomes a pandemic. And the mind-blowing thing for me was that they filmed it in Cambodia. They pretended it was Cambodia, and nobody from Cambodia actually said, would you mind not using our country as your like example? But they had already done it. They were done. But it was just fascinating. I agree that moving away from that is important. Although at the same time, the obsession with we must find out where it came from, because we can then know the purest version of the virus before it mutated, is also something that's scientifically desirable. I mean, why, aside from the politicians saying like, okay, y'all did a gain of function thing and you couldn't keep it in the lab, right? That's how it came out, versus, you know, it's the Wuhan seafood market. This is where it came from. Like, these two narratives keep coming back. And it's almost like we'll never get to the bottom, which is the Chinese aren't going to tell us and aren't going to let anybody in to actually investigate this. And so, you know, the disinformation campaign and the misinformation campaign and the malinformation campaigns will continue to spin tales of like, who is in fact, you know, behind all of this, and was this human created or just naturally occurring? Yeah, I think WHO. Look, WHO is between a rock and a hard. The Tedros, the head of WHO. You know, he tried to do this investigation. Then he got accused by Trump of like, you know, you're obviously a stooge of China, and then we pulled out of the WHO because it was like, obviously you're not doing what we're telling you to do. But without the WHO, even if it's a convener, it would be a far more dangerous world without the conversations that are needed globally about public health.
We have,
Something in there, I saw it, yes.
Cassandra, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, great. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I just want to piggyback off an earlier question. You had said that it would have been a much cheaper route to just spend a couple $1 billion as opposed to the trillions we ended up having to spend. What do you think we could do now, or what are some of the things that we could do now that we aren't doing that could get us ready for this upcoming third pandemic that you think is going to be hitting us this century, you know, that we aren't doing? Instead of just talking about things, what are some actions that we could do if we were putting money instead of just going for the new shiny thing at the top of the news cycle, you know?
Right. Thank you, Cassandra. And that's the whole, you know, basic health support, facility support for countries that otherwise have been struggling, right? I mean, the point about the 3% of rich countries spending is what poor countries are spending on healthcare. That's why there needs this disparity is the reason why you then have situations where when there's an outbreak, when there's a pandemic, there's no ability to actually figure out what's going on. So if you want to invest in better surveillance, you've got to help countries improve their basic health care first. And that's because, you know, whether it's Ebola, which I didn't get to talk about because I would still be talking about, I would still be lecturing about my slides now, or, you know, it is Zika virus or whatever it is. Countries face incredible challenges to providing healthcare when the focus is singularly on how to get, you know, the most fancy equipment in there when they don't need the most fancy equipment. And obsessing over the fancy, it's like giving somebody a Rolls Royce and saying you can't sell it, and you can't really, you have to keep this Rolls Royce and you have to maintain it for us. That's a dangerous proposition. And why countries then say, I'm sorry, I don't want your Rolls Royce. I'm not going to play this game of keeping this technology that we don't have the means to anyways maintain. I know it's, you know, the fundamentals are basically a more equitable world so that the parts of the world that can't deal with outbreaks can better deal with them. and then are better resourced, and then, of course, aren't left out there. Because, if Africa, for example, isn't getting any vaccines, what is happening is that they have to deal with it on their own. And even though it's part of that whole terrible origin story narrative thing, it then becomes like, of course, that's where, possibly the next outbreak is going to happen, because they really don't have anything to help them stop it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Julian has a question.
Yes, Julianne.
If there's not something online.
I think there's one more
Okay.
question.
There's one more? Okay.
It's about China, and if you could comment on, if China will let Americans come in, and do you think Americans will go back to China after having all these issues? Doing business in China is very unpredictable.
Yeah, no, I think, okay, but the question isn't, to be clear, I'm not answering it on the basis of, are they gonna be allowed to come in order to like figure out where the origin of the virus is and so on. It's just coming in, coming out. Yeah, I think China understands that international travel, including Americans, is beneficial to China. It's just that, aside from COVID having stopped the traveling and caused problems, and now these restrictions being lifted, there are other tensions, geopolitical tensions, that are causing people to have to wonder whether, if they go to China, this could be a problem for them in terms of, being detained or having issues with business disputes that are turned into judicial disputes, right? Like you're going to be jailed because your business partner doesn't want you to take your shares or whatever. But yeah, that's about rule of law, and it's about commercial business practices.
Okay.
Julianne.
I want to raise something kind of utopian and naive
Yeah.
and idealistic, but just to have it be part of the conversation. So how do we change the fundamentals of this sort of cycle of repetition that we can anticipate? And it seems that in this fourth revolution, or wherever we are,
Yeah.
one thing that's needed is sort of a paradigmatic shift in rethinking our rights as human beings. And so maybe there's a legal component to all of that. I'm saying that because yesterday, driving home, I heard an NPR report about a tiny Pacific
Nation,
Vanuatu.
Vanuatu.
about redefining the right to a clean environment as a
Right.
human right.
Mhm.
So what about having healthcare be part of that definition as well? And, orient the World Health Organization towards that. Do we not have another leverage legally in terms of international law to bring about some of these systematic changes that we're obviously running up against?
Yeah, and look, I think years ago there was a campaign of One Health that the WHO and the OIE, which is the World Animal Health Organization, sort of worked on to kind of say that, One Health is health for humans, health for animals, which would obviously be connected because of zoonosis. But arguing that health is a human right, access to health and a healthy environment seems like, what would normally be seen as the inevitable expansion of human rights, which is always in tension, in conflict with, governments that also don't want that, right? Or maybe they'll say it's the China dream, and you can have your healthy environment, just don't have your political rights. That's the one thing that we don't allow.
But also, many of the powerful players define their version of human rights and constitutions that are 200 years out of date or even longer, where we were actually working in a very different kind of industrial or pre-industrial environment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so when it comes to governance, defining those rights, sort of retro 200 years earlier, that makes it easier, right? It makes it easier for governments to say that, oh, you can pursue happiness and freedom, when really what you need is education and healthcare.
The right to education and healthcare, yeah. No, I agree. And look, I thought that originally when you were posing your question, Julianne, the answer I was going to give was one that I always pose to my students, which is like, what would be the quickest way to create more equity in the world, or more fairness in terms of economic outcomes. And does anybody want to venture to guess what would be the quickest way to do that? No?
Go ahead.
It would be to drop all borders. I mean, the borders are the reason why some countries are rich and some are poor, right? And at the moment you stop thinking of borders, then people can move and they can go to where opportunities are. But of course, this is very dangerous, and contrary to the idea of the nation state, with which we have based our system of global governance since 1648.
And people are voting with their feet these days. Right?
Yes, so right, so they can decide that they want to be they want to move countries. Of course, if they belong to a certain class of individuals allowed to make that move, or fortunate enough to make that move in the Rawlsian sense of they're just they won the lottery of life. Hopefully, things would be more fair than that. But
Given that the period from 1648 was mostly empires, not nation states, do we have any lessons that we can draw? Because the boundaries within empires were relatively low in terms of movement.
right, you mean people could move between empires and so
Within
on?
the empire,
Yeah,
you could go
yeah.
from Australia to Scotland, to Canada, to India,
Yeah,
to Nigeria,
yeah.
with relatively few constraints.
And nowadays, if you don't have the right papers, you'll be
Right.
turned back.
So I'm just wondering if there are any insights on the pandemic side. that
Yeah.
Come from the imperial moment, when movement was much freer than it is now.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, I won't even venture to guess there. I mean, you're saying that insights from the Westphalian times to today, when pandemics.
Or just when empires were the normal political architecture of the world.
Okay. Well, I am somewhat glad that we're not anymore dealing with too many empires, although we have the growth of some possible empires. But it's just that, I mean, our global system of migration is no longer. It's just, we've changed so much in terms of, even in the past, when Mexico and the US just allowed through temporary seasonal workers, right? They would come from Mexico and they would do their work, and then their idea was that they would just get some money and then they would go back to Mi Rancho back in Mexico, and just that would be the life that they would have. But when you started then this narrative of like this immigration crisis happening, we have to close the borders, and then it became, well, we're already here. Why would we go back and no longer be able to come back? We'll just stay here. That's how we created the real crisis, by basically saying there is a crisis and now we're going to do this. And it was a manufactured situation of politicians wanting to basically argue a certain narrative, and then it happened. I mean, I'm sure that it's not as simple as that, but essentially, if the world were more reasonable about travel these days, maybe things would be different. But with globalization, we're kind of seeing certain classes of people being able to go wherever they want to go and take diseases wherever they'd like, as a result, take those diseases. I mean, the opening, or maybe it's the trailer to the movie Contagion, is exactly this kind of notion, right? I mean, these people go to Asia, and next thing you know, there's some outbreak and it goes to the United States and so on. But yeah, I'm sorry, empire as a source of inspiration for the future.
No,
perhaps.
learning.
Yeah, of learning, sure.
In the sense that when borders within empires,
Yeah.
whether there are any insights we can draw in terms of managing the spread of disease
Mhm.
at a time when boundaries were in fact barriers to movement were fewer than
Yeah.
they are now, that's all.
Yeah,
I'm not advocating for empire.
no, of course not. That would
Unless
be
it's a space.
a Niall Ferguson thing. Yes, so any, some more activity in here? I saw something, but
No, it's
no, it's just a chat thing. Okay. All right,
So
yes,
if there are no borders, and this is,
Yeah.
I'm very interested in this conversation. So if there are no borders, who organizes the first responders?
right. The nearest fire station.
Who pays for them?
Yeah, right, like, right, so that it's a global government and the whole sort of UN as global government. No, you're quite right in that at the local level, who actually delivers the services and yeah, who collects the taxes, who creates the services, yeah. No, I there would still need to be services, there would still need to be taxes in order to pay for those services. But
Well, and what we're talking about today, who's doing the research?
yeah,
Who is,
yeah,
creating the knowledge to prevent
right,
pandemics?
right. Well, I hadn't thought about that part of it, but I would surmise that you would still have nation states, but the borders themselves wouldn't be as restrictive as they've become in terms of preventing people from moving. But that was the whole sort of international refugee system that was created to kind of say, okay, well, people who are fleeing from things that could kill them should not be sent back to their country. So please let them in or please protect them and so on. So that was, for those people that worked, but then migration became a kind of, well, you're an economic refugee. You shouldn't really be here. You don't have a reason for fleeing your country other than money. Right. Good point. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's
Thank
been
you.